Alastair Stewart, welcome back to GB News. It's been quite a year, of course, celebrating a year of His Majesty the King's reign, but very sadly, also inevitably, we're focusing on the death of Queen Elizabeth II, who reigned over us for 70 years. First of all, think back to early 2022. We hear all these rumours about the Queen's health, Buckingham Palace describing it as episodic mobility problems. What was the sense that you had in those early days of that year about the Queen's health?
Great place to start with this observation from me, and that was that unlike the late Queen Mother, for whom we almost had innumerable dress rehearsals, because whether she was at the Castle of May or at Balmoral herself, she was very often being rushed off to Aberdeen Hospital and judged to be seriously ill. More often than not, it involved a fishbone. But I can remember going back over many, many years thinking, this is it, this is it, this is one of those great moments that if you do what you and I do for a living, is something that you want to get right, accurate, the right tone and all the rest of it. But in that sense, we didn't have as specific a set of rehearsals, in inverted commas, for the late Queen as we did do indeed for her late mother. Ditto the Duke of Edinburgh, who it seemed to me over the period that you've just described, but also before that, he spent a good deal of time in hospital. He had a whole series of problems. With the Queen, there were these watchwords coming out, and we were aware, clearly as everybody was, of her age. The precise detail and nature of it, none of us knew until the publication of the death certificate.
Yes, and you mentioned the lack, perhaps, of hospital stays when it came to the late Queen. In fact, I remember Buckingham Palace was, really trying to avoid having to tell the public that the Queen had spent a night in hospital for exploratory tests, I think was the phrase they used. And it's only after a newspaper, I think it was The Sun, published the facts that the Queen was in hospital that they were forced to confirm that news. Why do you think Buckingham Palace didn't tell us that?
It's a mystery to me as well, because I'm not entirely sure that it was the right judgment, because I think that one of the very few things that was predictable about these events, and we'll come on to the succession and the Queen is dead and long live the King, which is vital to the continuity of our constitution and how well it was handled. And I would have quietly whispered in somebody's ear, the nation would like to be prepared because the nation would like to prepare itself for something that will matter enormously to them, the passing of one of the greatest public servants ever. Who barely put a foot wrong. I think perhaps a little sharing would not have gone amiss. But the other thing, you're quite rightly about her state of health and that dramatic moment where she did have to spend a night in hospital, was that we also know, and you much better than I, that the care and attention that surrounded her in that final period, whether it was the Balmoral bubble, as it was called, or whether the care and attention at Windsor, she was surrounded by the best possible medical support that was available. It's inevitable and it's right and proper. So in that sense, that part of the master plan worked. And I like to think that what we and colleagues in our profession did in that period of a few days was sufficiently good and strong that, as it were, they got away with being shh, and we managed to prepare ourselves as best we could to draw the nation in to the loss not only of their head of state, but of a mother, a grandmother, and a relatively recently bereaved widow.
2 days before the announcements that the Queen had died, I was at Balmoral, outside the gates, because Liz Truss, of course, was being appointed Prime Minister. Usually a Prime Minister appointed at Buckingham Palace, but because of the Queen's health, they decided to bring Boris and then Liz up to Scotland. And we had those photographs of the late Queen inside her drawing room in Balmoral. What was your first thoughts when you saw those photographs? The way she looks, the way she was smiling at Liz?
Oh, I thought they were wonderful photographs. And in fact, one or two others have subsequently trickled out. And what I loved about it was, as the newspapers do very often do very well, is they explained that that painting in the background was a Landseer, which was one of her favourites, whether it's the Great Stag or whatever it might be, that she was wearing the tartan, and that her occasional tables, beautiful bits of furniture, were littered with precious photographs of friends and family, and it was just a tableau of what made this remarkable woman tick. I also thought, and forgive me from being a bit political, that there was something very, very special about even in what proved to be her last few days / weeks, it was duty, it was service, it was doing the job. So she received an outgoing Prime Minister and she received an incoming Prime Minister.
Duty until the end. And we come to the day, the 8th of September, only a year ago, although to me it seems a lot longer than that. I'm not sure if you feel the same. But at 12:32, Buckingham Palace released that first statement saying that doctors were concerned for her health. Can you remember the moments you heard that statement? Was it a news alert on your phone? Did someone ring you from the office? Because you or I don't think were scheduled to actually be in that day, were
Yes.
we? Yeah. So how did you find out?
Literally that, as so often happens if you've been in this business for as long as I have, you're in the newsroom because it's the place that you need to be professionally, but also, to be honest, purely personally, it's the place you want to be. And it comes across either on the Press Association news wires, or it's a phone call to someone like you as our royal correspondent, royal editor, and then you disseminate appropriately to people from the top of the pecking order down, so that everybody is across what is going to happen and what is going to happen very shortly.
Yes, and so you came into the newsroom having that first statement saying she was ill and the doctors were concerned for her health. What was the atmosphere like in the newsroom when you came in? What sort of time did you arrive at the office?
Oh, I think I think it was electric, and one's always tempted to go with the cliches and you cut the atmosphere with a knife and so on. But it was. We are a news organisation, and we were then, and we still are to a great extent, the new kids on the block. And it was one of those occasions where we all knew we had to do our level best to get it right. And it's never easy, whether it's a clip of film that's not in quite the right order, or a word that's not absolutely le mot juste, the perfect word for the moment. You really do try. And part of that is preparation. And we all do it. We do the notes. We go in with notes. And I remember Alastair Stewart once saying to me, one day the time will come where all you'll go into the studio with is a Post-it note, and it'll just be one fact that you, however hard you've tried, you can't remember, not with lots of files. And absolutely right, because it really matters. It'll be here and it'll also be in your heart. And so as long as you can get the floppy disk working, you'll access it. There's a chill to it because you know that's it. This is the announcement that you have been asked to read out.
Yes, and you were in the studio probably, I don't know, half an hour before that announcement came out, weren't you? So at 6:30, when Buckingham Palace gave us the statement, did somebody in your ear tell you that you're about to announce the death? Were you handed a sheet of paper with the statement on? What was that process and what was going through your mind just before you announced it?
I think one of the key things that was going through my mind and that of my bosses was that I was wearing a black tie, because the colour of tie matters. It's a question of respect, and colleagues in the past have not got it right. So that was a small point, but it was typically one of those points that utterly mattered. To me, the words that even ring in my ear now in conversation to you were, in effect, it's you. You're doing it, and this is the piece of paper, and it will be on what we call teleprompt. Some call it auto cue, but there's a little television screen hung under the lens of the camera that I'm talking to. I'm not talking to one now, I'm talking to you directly, but we're surrounded by cameras and they don't have them on it. And so it was crucially important that one had that piece of paper, just in case that bit of kit went down, because it's not a form of words that you want to try and remember or make up as you go along. Those were words that had been agreed at levels well above my pay grade. And I just remember thinking, gosh, this is one of the big ones.
And then, of course, you had to actually read it out, announce the death, and then we were rolling on it.
Yes. I don't know if I said to you afterwards, but I did genuinely find it very emotional reading it out, not only because of the burden of responsibility on my shoulders, but on the shoulders of the entire team at GB News and those who were kind enough to be watching us and listening to us, as opposed to any of the other great colleagues who were also doing it. But it was the passing of a remarkable woman who I genuinely, throughout my entire professional career, had admired and had had the extraordinary honour of meeting on a couple of occasions through charity events. And also when I received my OBE, I was lucky enough, and I choose that word quite carefully, to be awarded it and given it by her. Because obviously as she got older, many other people would step into her shoes when it came to investitures, so you weren't always guaranteed to get the Queen. But I did, and I have some wonderful photographs that are amongst my most cherished possessions, as reminders.
Very lucky. And you speak of the emotion of the moment, and it's a difficult balance, isn't it? Being a private individual, as you say, a British citizen, the death of the monarch is clearly going to be very sad, but keeping the composure, doing your professional job, and also in the back of your mind, you have, thousands of people are watching you on television, and you are the one telling them. So it is a balance.
And also part of the brain, because we're professionals, is doing the what's next bit. In the sense that having uttered the words, "The Queen is dead, long live the King," and I wasn't the first to say it, but it's important to note that, because within those few words, there's a statement of enormous political and constitutional importance that we had to reflect as well as, and I repeat myself now quite consciously, reflecting the fact that to the vast majority of the folk who were kind enough to be watching or listening to us, this really mattered. This wasn't just an other who had died, and it wasn't some here today, gone tomorrow politician. This was a woman who had served this country, had worn her father's uniform, and had served in the Second World War as a woman reservist, had stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace alongside Winston Churchill, had literally been there, done it, on behalf of her family and on behalf of our country. It was an awesome moment.
And she was the Queen of the United Kingdom, of course, an incredibly diverse country. I was at Luton Airport trying to get the last flight to Aberdeen to get me to Balmoral when that statement dropped. And what struck me was the passengers all over the terminal at that moment. I received the statement first from Buckingham Palace. There was a couple of minutes delayed, and then you saw them all get their news flashes on their phone. And you could just see faces, different backgrounds, different ages, just drop. And the shock of it, that we had lost someone who'd reigned over us for 70 years. So it really was something that sticks in the mind of the whole country, right?
Yes, and it, in a curious way, and it's not an observation of about race or ethnicity. The Commonwealth mattered to her throughout her entire life, and her son, the King, has embraced that very much as well. And it always struck me that the Queen was never one who needed to have diversity explained to her, and never needed to tick boxes to prove her acceptance of diversity. It was natural to her, and indeed the Commonwealth was a reflection of that.
And following that initial announcement, you then handed over to Nigel an hour or so later. You come out the studio to a newsroom who've probably had a pretty busy couple of hours, hadn't they? What was the reaction or atmosphere like then, and also going home as well at the end of the day? Because it's something realistically that you don't announce the death of a monarch every day, do you? It's quite a unique moment.
It is, and I think the atmosphere in the newsroom was that we'd done it and that we'd got through it, and it was a test for us. Let's make no mistake about it. We're realists. We know that these things are looked at a lot more closely because it's our first go at it, and we are GB News. And I think the sense in the newsroom was that it was a job well done. But crucially, as is always the case amongst professionals, not least GB News, is what happens next. And Nigel plays a blinder. He knows that world. He's steeped in history. We've got a brilliant army of experts and contacts who either you would be talking to or would come as studio guests to make sure that we weren't missing any of the nuances of the political dimension, the constitutional and historic dimension, but also the sheer humanity of it. There was a lot of discussion and debate, which got quite edgy on occasion, I remember. And I don't mean edgy in the sense of arguing amongst each other. We weren't arguing amongst each other. But the degree to which you acknowledge the schisms within that family, and where is the Duke of York, because we knew that Charles and Anne were there, and how will the younger children deal with this, because it's Gangan and the rest of it, and Harry and Meghan. These were edgy issues that needed to be confronted and needed to be dealt with. Most of the key players, we knew where they were, not least because you knew where they were and were telling us, but how we covered it. And if X didn't turn up, or X appeared not to judge it perfectly, how would we react to that? All of that stuff matters as well. And in a grown-up news organisation like GB News, we discuss those things openly amongst ourselves. We take a position, we take a decision, and then we go ahead together.
Yes, and of course we had 10 days of coverage to then fill, and you talk about the little nuances, the smallest details, like what Prince Harry would be permitted to wear at the funeral. Is it different from Prince Andrew, of course, no longer working royals? And it's balancing that with, of course, you don't want to detract, do you, from the main event, which is the death of the monarch.
One thing that sums it up for me is that on that day, everything changed and nothing changed. That everything changed in the sense that she was dead, she was gone, and a remarkable line was drawn under a period of truly remarkable history. But also the longest apprenticeship in history since Edward VII had come to an end, and that Charles, Prince of Wales, was now King Charles. But equally, his son, William, had gone from being the heir presumptive, i.e. heir to his father, who was the heir apparent, to becoming himself the heir apparent, and his young son, George, then became the heir presumptive.
How do you think the king did over that 10 days of mourning and also his accession?
I think that leaky pens can be forgotten and binned as a slightly amusing moment. And goodness me, I don't blame him for being slightly annoyed that maybe the pen leaked a wee bit. But
we can cut him some slack for that.
Moving on from that, and I mean he has great history about spider-like writing, and maybe it was somebody trying to avoid spider-like writing to senior ministers and the rest of it, and got it slightly wrong. Doesn't matter. The rest of it, to use street language, I think he played a blinder. For him, his mum had died. It's not that long ago since his dad and his beloved grandma had died, and he was suddenly inheriting the job, the post, the title, the responsibility and the expectation that had been his all his life. And there's a lovely line in The Madness of King George, which is that being Prince of Wales is not an office. It's a condition that you have to endure. And suddenly, it was his, all of it, but only because his mother had died. And many people listening to this conversation will know that. It happens to all families, but this is the royal family. This was the late head of state and the new head of state. I think the fact that he was not only willing, but I understand, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand he was actively keen that things like the Accession Council, the formal handing over and the agreement of the Privy Council, there would have been some who would have argued that the cameras shouldn't have been there. because it's the Badgett line about a peek behind the curtains destroys the magic. Not my view at all. My view is that the late Queen and the King made absolutely the correct decision, that it was part of the transition and it was a reflection of the political and constitutional nature of the transition. And yes, it's happened over decades, and it's the first time that we've been able to do it in half a century. So yes, let's do that.
The most ancient institution, arguably, in the world, the royal family, the death of the late Queen, 70 years of service. GB News, the youngest, or one of the youngest national broadcasters, news broadcasters in the country, without the resources of, let's say, mainstream, larger broadcasters. A challenge for us in a sense, but I think what we perhaps did well was putting people first and going into pubs or youth or centres, community centres around the country, and getting their views. And it was really important, wasn't it, for us to really get the public's views on this momentous occasion?
Yes, I remember spending one weekend in some playing fields in the Midlands, and lots of mums and dads and lots of children, and trying to capture the mood and balance the sadness with the elation that there was to be a transition, that we now had a new king, a new monarch, and I thought that was absolutely a correct call. It's not a point of marketing, but we are proud to call ourselves the People's Channel, and I occasionally sit at home watching what I think folk tend to call the mainstream, more established broadcasters. And if ever I get down in the dumps about it, is when I sense that air of them being somewhat above it all, and this is all about us, and it's not. It's all about the audience, be they on radio or be they on television, and what it means to them. It is our duty and our honour. Again, as Alastair Stewart used to say, it's just our duty and honour to read the news out, but in a way that captures what people will be talking about in the bus queues and in the canteens the next day. But essentially, from a standing start, what GB News, I think, captured, which is why I joined it in the first place with great pleasure and great pride, is that there was a gap in the market for a broadcaster that put that first and foremost. What ordinary folk care about and are worried about and are asking about and thinking about, and reflecting it, their joy, their sadness, all the rest of it. And so in that sense, I think we did okay. I think we did more than okay. And it was complex because it was all of those emotions surrounding the death of a giant figure.
Yes, and we're a year into King Charles's reign now. What's the sense you're getting in terms of the kind of monarch he will be going forward? We mentioned the coronation a little bit, the fact he'd adapted it to perhaps reflect modern Britain today, but still keeping those ancient institutions such as the anointing. And what are your kind of predictions for him going forward now?
I'm a huge fan of the Prince's Trust, and the Prince's Trust, I think, speaks volumes to what makes this man tick. And it's a little bit like what I said about the late Queen and diversity. Nobody needs to tell Charles, who went to Gordonstoun and went to Oxbridge College, about the fact that there are different sides of the track, and some of us are born with greater fortune, literally and metaphorically, than others. But that within each and every one of us, and I think his late mother believed it, and I know for a fact that he believes it with passion, each and every one of us have something very special. It may yet be discovered. It may need a little encouragement, a little support, and it may be somebody who went the wrong side of the tracks in the East End of London, and all they needed was an apprenticeship. All they needed was a little bit of support for a business that they wanted to set up under the arches around Waterloo and so on. And so he did all of that. And then he went on television at the repair shop and made a special programme about all that he does in that. And that's a relatively young man, embracing all of his people and finding a charitable cause that can encourage the best in all of us. And him, from his position of influence and wealth, yes, and wealth, can help folk on the way. And I've no doubt in my mind that that philosophy will be the driving force behind his monarchy and the reign, the Carolean, Charles III era. And I welcome it and I say hurrah to it, because I, like Churchill on democracy, I know that there are many illogicalities about monarchy, but once you tried out some of the others, it ends up perhaps being not a bad compromise. And I think in his hands, it's relatively safe.
Alastair Stewart, thank you very much.
Pleasure talking to you.
And you.
Always a pleasure working with you. Thank you.
And always.